Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I'm coming to you today to talk about the third chapter in Paulo Freire's inimitable Pedagogy of the Oppressed. A big chapter, possibly the biggest in the work, though I didn't do the page count, so I'm not 100% confident of that. From where we're leaving off in the second chapter is the manner in which Freire has established that you have, a choice with regard to the model that you're going to invoke in reference to education. On one hand, you can take up what he terms the banking, or if you like, depository model, where the relationship between the teacher and the student is essentially unidirectional. The teacher takes the content and transmits it to the student who passively receives it. On the other side of the ledger, that is the other option, is what Freire variously terms emancipatory, liberating, humanitarian education. The kind of education which is indispensable for a pedagogy of the oppressed. And it is an education which renounces this unidirectionality in favor of a conversation, a dialogue between the teacher and the student and the teacher, where the content stands, as it were, between them as a kind of mediation, a mediating point, a substance upon which the various perspectives, or through which the various perspectives of the teacher-student and the student-teacher can interface and interact and perhaps sort of co-synthesize, if you like, to arrive at a new, broader, more embracing consciousness. That's speaking loosely, but the key to that kind of an educational process is an interaction which is dialogical as opposed to monological. And what constitutes the conditions of possibility for dialogue? And is the establishment of these conditions of possibility, which is the opening of chapter 3. And Freire sort of sets out 5 points or 5 sort of prerequisites for that sort of conversation. The most significant of which is love. Love both of the other people with whom you're having conversation and love of the world itself. Absent love, it becomes very difficult to avoid a kind of regression where the process of conversation, which is a process of naming, to which point I shall return momentarily, becomes only an instrument for domination, where certain people want to name the world in a way which disserves, excludes, perhaps oppresses others. And this relates to the notion of what is the word and how the true word is not simply something which is articulated, not simply a process of sort of cognitive evaluation, but is something which engenders action. That there is a unity of thought and action in true speech that has been sometimes put under the name of praxis, and that it is this speech as praxis, or as related intimately with praxis, which is constitutive of real dialogue. And it is the manner in which one names the world so that it can then in turn be recreated. And this is really sort of like where the rubber hits the road in terms of the question of what does it mean to be a human being. To be a human being is to understand the world not as a closed, but an open horizon. To realize that the world is not a closed but open horizon, one must also realize that oneself is not a closed but a set of open possibilities. And there's a dialectical relationship there, because it's not a question of being merely open, in which there's a total groundlessness that almost precludes meaningful action. There's a tension which arises as a consequence of limitation, of certain kinds of finitude that ultimately conduces to a more active, more fulfilling relationship with being, with existence, with life itself. And I'm kind of freewheeling here. I'm not following the text itself that closely, though all these themes are present in the text in a relatively explicit fashion. So let's try and draw it back there. Okay, to draw back, what's going on in the third chapter is, after setting up that we need to be in dialogue, and the dialogue is a process of naming and relating with the world, which is built upon the foundation of love, what you also need is humility. Because absent humility, which allows you to sort of relate correctly with the world and other people, there is similarly a regression to an attitude of domination, right? There has to be a realization of one's own limitations and also of others' potentialities and possibilities, so that there can be a mutual respect. And I don't even really like the word respect there, because it's inadequate, I think, to the sort of positive emotionality to which Freire is exhorting us. In connection with love, with humility, there is faith. There is faith in the possibility of human being and human beings, of other people and of ourselves, as being able to stand in a positive relationship with the universe, which allows us to sort of creatively move in the universe in historically meaningful fashion. In fact, for Freire, it is precisely when we enter into the world historically that we are entering into what is distinctively our humanity. Now, in this regard, he does set up a duality, which I think is a little bit problematic, between the human and the animal. Understanding that the animal just sort of accepts the world as it is and is in a constantly reactive relationship to it, so that its interaction with its environment is almost merely a mechanical affair. He contrasts this with the human ability to be conscious of the environment in a way which allows the person to exceed the implications of the environment, and ultimately that capacity is grounded in not simply its assessment of the environment, of the world, but also in the person's assessment of his own self, his own or her own identity, as something that can be transformed, expanded, transcended, etc., etc. What's problematic is that I feel he's not giving animals the merit they deserve, and we won't tarry on this point here, except to sort of say that I feel that the distinction at which he's pointing doesn't necessarily have to be connected to the issue of what is the animal as opposed to what is the human. He's driving at different levels or possibilities of consciousness that vary according to how one frames, conceives, puts, understands the space, the environment into which one is, if you like, thrown, inserted, where we find ourselves. And if we have a sort of restrained, quote-unquote, animal disposition, then we're going to understand that world as marked by a kind of fixity which is decidedly disempowering. We really enter into our capacity as free beings. We are not so complacent. We believe that the world can be addressed in a transformative fashion. So these are the major points through which he proceeds in the first section of the chapter. Appending to the criteria of love, hope, and faith, or love, humility, and faith, two further points. One being the point of hope, which I've already sort of implicitly addressed, because by hope, what he means is the disposition to address the world, to address history, is something which we can change, which we can affect in a positive way. And the fifth point is an insistence upon critical thought, critical thinking, which is essentially what is sometimes called dialectical thinking. Thinking which recognizes the world as dynamic and as a kind of and as the being, and recognizes that the being of the world and the being of ourselves are related inextricably. So in affecting one, we affect the other. And moreover, there is a recognition that everything is provisional, that even if we succeed in moving from a current situation into an even into a preferable situation, that situation will itself have its own contradictions, limitations, lacunae, gaps that in turn can be addressed, so a further supersession can be attained. And along those lines, he's obviously drawing heavily upon the Hegelian and Marxist traditions. And he's also sort of definitely more than just tipping his hat to some existentialists along the way, like Carl Jaspers, Jaspers. I'm never quite certain how to say his last name. But he brings him up specifically in connection with what he refers to as limit situations. Okay, now limit situations have an ambivalence, an ambiguity to them. On one hand, they can be the fashion in which the contours of our world seem to restrict or confine our potentiality. On the other hand, the very structures which limit or confine our potentiality can be reframed as steps on the staircase, as what we can engage to become more than what we are today. They become opportunities for transcendence. But in order for them to become opportunities for transcendence, they must be recognized for what they are as limits, necessitating a transformation of consciousness, and decidedly to recall the distinction between quote-unquote animal and human consciousness as he puts it in the text. Again, I would probably try and find a different language there, which was in sort of meaning to the animal realm. But to move beyond the kind of condition of acceptance and passivity to one which is active and superseding, that is the task at hand. And that is what happens when you recognize limitations as limit situations as opportunities. Okay, so that is where he goes through in the first half. He then turns in the second, roughly, or the latter, let's say the latter portion of the chapter, then articulates a program or sketch for a program of education to try and effect exactly this kind of change in consciousness in a community, if you like, or as a group. Because it's absolutely vital to recall that we must avoid the dangers of regression into an attitude of domination, of imposition of oppression, which dangers inhere whenever we lose track of a principle of humility and of solidarity. So I will address, or in the next video, which I'll probably do that tomorrow, this program that he sets up, since we're already over 15 minutes here. All right. But so we'll just say this is talking about the first portion of chapter 3 then, and I'll take up the second portion tomorrow. Hopefully this summary has been valuable for you guys, and I will catch you guys on the flip. Thank you. Bye.